Everyone talks about the P-51 Mustang, but the real argument that won the air war was about a plane we didn't build. The Nazis laughed at America's flying fortresses. They called them slow, flying targets. They weren't entirely wrong. In 1942, a single British plane made of wood terrified the Luftwaffe. So why did America bet everything on massive, slow-moving metal? The Nazis laughed at America's flying fortresses. They called them slow, flying targets, and in the dark, desperate days of 1942 and 1943, they weren't entirely wrong. Hermann Goering, the chief of the Luftwaffe, looked at the first American B-17s lumbering across the English Channel, and he genuinely believed they were delivering themselves for slaughter. His aces, the battle-hardened pilots who had conquered Poland, France, and the Low Countries, they called them Wehrmacht, the four motors. They saw them as coffins with wings, predictable, heavy, and ripe for the picking. They scoffed, and for a heartbreakingly long time, the skies over the Reich proved them right. The losses were a kind of industrial-scale butchery that is almost impossible for us to wrap our minds around today. Young men, many just boys really, barely out of high school, were being sent 5 miles up into the freezing blue on missions where the odds of completing their 25-mission tour were, well, frankly, they were terrible. On some raids, the chance of not coming back from that single mission was as high as 1 in 5. Think about that. Every time you went up, a 20% chance you'd be dead, captured, or wounded before sunset. The core of that German confidence, the root of their deadly arrogance, came from one simple, devastating fact. They believed the Americans had fundamentally misunderstood the air war. They believed we had built the wrong plane entirely. You see, the British, in their desperate hour, had produced what many in the world considered the perfect bomber for the time. It was a phantom, a ghost. The de Havilland Mosquito, the wooden wonder. It was a masterpiece of lateral thinking. While everyone else was building bigger, heavier, and slower, the British built a plane out of plywood and balsa wood, the same materials you might find in a model airplane kit. They didn't bother with heavy armor. They didn't weigh it down with a dozen machine guns. They just gave it 2 of the most powerful engines on Earth, the Rolls-Royce Merlins, the very same engines that powered their legendary Spitfire fighters. The result? The Mosquito was so fast, it could simply outrun most of the German fighters sent to intercept it. It was a phantom. It could appear over Berlin in broad daylight, drop its bombs, and be halfway home before the air raid sirens had even finished winding up. The Mosquito operated on a simple, elegant philosophy. Why weigh yourself down with a fortress of armor and guns when you can simply not get hit in the first place? It was brilliant. It was infuriating. And the Germans, while they hated it, they deeply respected it. It was a thoroughbred. So in 1942, when the first waves of the 8th Air Force began arriving in England, the German High Command, the aces like Adolf Galland and Werner Mulders, they looked at what we, the great industrial power of the world, had brought to the fight, and they were, to put it mildly, unimpressed. They were puzzled. And then they were amused. We hadn't brought a Mosquito. We had brought the exact polar opposite. We brought the B-17 Flying Fortress, and we brought the B-24 Liberator. These planes were not fast. They were not light. They were not made of wood. They were massive, sprawling 4-engine behemoths forged from aluminum and steel. They were built on a completely different, almost stubborn American idea. That idea was this: we expect to get hit. We know we will be attacked, and when we are, we will fly through the fire. We will soak up the damage, and while we're doing it, we will hit back, harder. The B-17 wasn't just a bomber, it was a statement. It bristled with 13 50-caliber heavy machine guns, each one a weapon that could tear a fighter plane in half. It was designed to fly in a combat box, a formation of dozens of planes, stacked and staggered, creating a 360-degree field of interlocking fire. It was, in theory, a self-defending formation, a flying fortress, just as the newspapers back home claimed. It was brute force. It was industrial might. It was very American. But this philosophy, this stubborn belief in firepower and toughness over speed and grace, came with a terrible, terrible cost. The German pilots, Flying their Focke-Wulf 190s and their Messerschmitt 109s were not intimidated. They were hunters, and these were the biggest game in the sky. They quickly learned the B-17's weaknesses. It was slower. Its guns were manually aimed by men in freezing, rattling compartments, and it had a blind spot right in the front. So the Luftwaffe pilots, with cold, professional courage, changed their tactics. They stopped attacking from the rear, where the B-17's tail gunner was waiting. Instead, they would gather in wolf packs, 20 or 30 strong, fly miles ahead of the bomber stream, turn around, and come straight at them head-on. A Stirnenflug, a head-on attack. Imagine it. You're a 21-year-old kid from Peoria, Illinois, sitting in the plexiglass nose of a B-17. You're the bombardier. Your job is miles ahead, but right now, your job is the 2.50 cals in front of you. The air outside is 60 degrees below zero. The air inside isn't much warmer. You're on oxygen, your breath fogging your mask. And then you see them. Specks on the horizon, but they're not specks for long. They're growing fast. A dozen, 24 Focke-Wulfs, wingtip to wingtip, flying straight at your windshield at a combined closing speed of over 600 miles per hour. You have seconds to aim, to fire, to pray. Their 20mm cannons open up, and you see flashes winking along their wings like evil stars. And then they are on you and through you. Tracers fill the sky, a storm of red and green. You feel the plane shudder as cannon shells, some of them explosive, tear through the thin aluminum skin next to your head. The noise is indescribable. The roar of your own guns, the shriek of the wind, and the percussive thump, thump, thump of flak from the ground, and the metallic bang of cannon shells finding their mark. This was the price of the American philosophy. This was the moment where the German scoffing felt chillingly accurate. In those few seconds of a head-on pass, a bomber could be ripped open, an engine set ablaze, a pilot killed instantly. The Mosquito concept, flying fast, high, and alone, must have seemed like a wonderful dream to those crews. The Germans scoffed because on paper and in the sky, their strategy was working. The Mosquito was a scalpel, a nuisance, making quick, headline-grabbing but strategically limited cuts. The American bombers, they believed, were a hammer trying to smash a mountain, and the hammer was shattering with every blow. The Germans believed that this American obsession with daylight precision bombing was a fool's errand. The British had already tried it in 1939 and 40 with their Wellington and Hampden bombers, and they were massacred. They quickly and wisely, in the German view, switched to night bombing. It was less accurate, to be sure. It was area bombing, but it saved their crews. But the Americans were stubborn. The leaders of the 8th Air Force, men like Ira Eaker and Carl Spaatz, believed in a new doctrine. They believed in the Norden bomb sight. This was a top-secret piece of technology, a mechanical computer that, in theory, could allow a bombardier to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. The entire American strategy rested on this device. We weren't there to burn cities down, not at first. We were there to surgically destroy the factories, the U-boat pens, the oil refineries, and the ball-bearing plants that fueled the Nazi war machine. And you could only do that. You could only see the pickle barrel in broad daylight. So the stage was set for a monumental clash of ideas. On one side, the German defense confident that their fighters could destroy any daylight raid. On the other, the American offense, confident that their flying fortresses could fight their way through. And in the background, the whispers of the Mosquito, the plane that proved that speed, not defense, was the key. The Germans scoffed, but they missed something. They missed one crucial, fundamental piece of the puzzle. They were so focused on the bombers, they didn't see what was coming next. They scoffed at the B-17, but they hadn't yet seen the bomber's guardian angel. Before we get to that, we have to understand just how right the Germans were for a time. We have to talk about the crucible. We have to talk about 1943. If you've ever known someone who served in the 8th Air Force or any aircrew from that war, we hope you'll think of them as we go through this. We are here making these stories because we believe that what they did must never be forgotten. And if you feel the same, sharing this story with a friend or a family member is the greatest way to honor that memory. The American strategy was called the Combined Bomber Offensive. The British Royal Air Force would bomb the German cities by night, hitting morale and the workers. The American 8th Air Force would bomb the German factories by day, hitting the war machine itself, a round-the-clock assault. But to get to the factories, deep inside Germany, the bombers had to fly through a gauntlet. The German defense was a layered, deeply intelligent system. They had coastal radar. They had forward airfields with short-range fighters. They had heavy flak batteries, the dreaded 88s, guarding every potential target. And deeper in, they had the Jagdgeschwader, the fighter wings, waiting. The Americans knew they needed fighter escort, but in 1943, we had a terrible problem: range. Our best fighters just couldn't go the distance. The magnificent British Spitfire was a short-range interceptor designed to defend its home turf. It had the legs for a quick trip over the channel, but not for a 5-hour journey to Berlin. We had the P-47 Thunderbolt, the Jug, a monster of a plane, tough, rugged, and armed with 8.50 cals. It was a brawler, but it drank fuel at an astonishing rate. It could get the bombers to the German border, maybe a little past it, but then its fuel warning lights would blink. The P-47 pilots would waggle their wings in a sad goodbye and peel off for home, leaving the bombers alone. And the Germans knew this. They waited. They would track the formations just outside the range of the American fighters, like sharks circling a convoy. The moment the little friends turned for home, the German flight controllers would give the order, attack. And the bombers, the fortresses, were alone. This led to some of the darkest days in American military history. August 17th, 1943. The Double Strike Mission. The plan was audacious. The 8th Air Force would split. One force would hit the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg. The other would hit the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. These were vital targets. The Regensburg force, after dropping its bombs, would be too low on fuel to return to England. They would have to fly south, over the Alps, to bases in North Africa. A one-way trip. The mission was a disaster. The coordination broke down. The two forces, which were supposed to split the German defense, ended up flying hours apart. The Luftwaffe was able to intercept the first wave, the Regensburg group, land, refuel, rearm, and then rise up to meet the second wave, the Schweinfurt group. They got 2 fights for the price of 1. That day, the 8th Air Force lost 60 heavy bombers. 60, each with a crew of 10 men. That's 600 men killed or captured in a single afternoon. The crews that made it to Africa were shattered. The crews that limped back to England were traumatized. The Germans were jubilant. Their scoffing seemed entirely justified. Goring was ecstatic. But the Americans? They weren't done. They were stubborn. They knew Schweinfurt's ball-bearing plants, the Kugelfischer works, were still operating. They had to go back. October 14th, 1943. The day that would be known forever as Black Thursday. The target was Schweinfurt again. This time there was no diversion, just a straight-in, straight-out punch. 291 B-17s deep into Germany. The P-47s could only go part of the way. The bombers would be alone,
unescorted in hostile sky for more than 3 hours. Every German fighter wing in Western Europe was scrambled. Over 300 German fighters, 109s, 190s, even twin-engine night fighters with heavy cannons, rose up to meet them. They attacked in waves, relentlessly, for hours. They used the head-on passes. They used air-to-air rockets. They flew through the American formations. The sky became a charnel house. A radio operator on one of the B-17s, a man named Robert Rosenthal, later recalled, "We were under attack for 3 solid hours. It seemed like the entire German Air Force was up there." He wasn't far wrong. Bombers began to fall out of the sky one after another. Some exploded in massive fireballs, hit in the bomb bay. Others, engines blazing, spiraled down. Some, shot to ribbons, simply fell out of formation, where the German fighters, like wolves, would pick them off one by one. Men bailed out into the freezing air, their parachutes blossoming against the dark smoke. Men died at their guns. Men were trapped in burning, spinning wrecks. That day, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers again. But this time, it was worse. Another 17 were so badly damaged they were scrapped on landing. 5 more crash-landed in England. In total, 82 bombers were gone. Of the 291 planes that set out, only 33 returned undamaged. And the cost in men, 650 airmen, was staggering. Black Thursday broke the back of the 8th Air Force. The daylight bombing campaign, the core of the American strategy, was halted. We could not sustain those losses. It was perhaps the Luftwaffe's greatest victory. The German High Command had been right. Their scoffing was validated. An unescorted, slow-moving heavy bomber, even a Fortress, could not survive over the Reich. The Mosquito, flying its fast lone wolf missions, looked like the only concept that truly worked. The American gamble, it seemed, had failed. In the dark, wet autumn of 1943, in the air bases across East Anglia, there was a terrible silence. The bombers were grounded. The strategy was in ruins. The Germans had won. But they hadn't. Because in that silence, something was happening. A new sound was being heard over the fields of England. A high-pitched, screaming whine, a sound that would become the death knell of the Luftwaffe. The Germans had scoffed at the slow American bomber. They were about to meet its very, very fast little friend.
The problem was never the B-17. The B-17 was a magnificent airplane. It could absorb punishment that would have disintegrated any other machine. There are stories, photographs, of Fortresses landing back in England with their tails nearly shot off, with engines gone, with holes you could walk through. The plane was tough. The crews were tougher. The problem was not the plane. The problem was the philosophy. The idea of the self-defending bomber was a myth. It was a noble, brave myth, but it had been paid for in the blood of thousands. The bomber could not defend itself. It needed help. It needed a guardian. The problem, as we said, was range. The P-47s were tough, but thirsty. We had the P-38 Lightning, a fantastic twin-engine plane, but it had its own technical problems in the cold, high air of Europe. What the 8th Air Force needed, what General Eaker and General Doolittle, who soon took command, were begging for, was a long-legged fighter, a plane that could go all the way to the target and back. And America, the arsenal of democracy, was about to deliver it. The plane was the P-51 Mustang. Now, the Mustang had been around for a bit. It was originally designed by North American Aviation for the British, but the early versions were underwhelming. They used an Allison engine, which was a good, solid American engine, but it just didn't have the oomph at high altitude. It was good down low, but worthless up where the bombers flew. And here is where the story has a wonderful, almost poetic twist. The British, the ones with the Mosquito, looked at this promising American airframe and had a brilliant idea. They said, what if we put our engine, the Rolls-Royce Merlin, into your plane? It was like putting a racing engine into a pickup truck. It was a revelation. The new plane, the P-51B, was a world beater. It was fast, maneuverable, and sleek. But it still had the range problem. The solution was almost comically simple. Drop tanks, just massive disposable fuel tanks fitted under the wings. The Mustang would take off, fly for hours on the fuel from these external tanks, and then, when the German fighters appeared, the pilot would hit a switch, the empty tanks would fall away, and the P-51 would be a lightweight, thoroughbred fighter, full of internal fuel, ready to fight. But the final, crucial piece wasn't just the plane. It was the man. In late 1943, General Jimmy Doolittle, the same man who had led the audacious raid on Tokyo in 1942, took command of the 8th Air Force. He was a man who understood air power, and he was a man who understood aggression. He looked at the new P-51s arriving. He looked at the grounded, shattered bomber crews, and he threw out the rulebook. The old doctrine was that the fighters must stick to the bombers. Close escort, they called it. Fly right next to them, protect them at all costs. But this was defensive. It meant that the fighters were just waiting to be attacked. Doolittle changed everything with one order. He told his fighter pilots, "Your first duty is to destroy German fighters." He set them free. He told them, "Go hunt. Don't just wait for the enemy to come to you. Go find them. Sweep ahead of the bombers. Find their airfields. Find them while they're still climbing. Attack them. Chase them, and do not let them go until they are a smoking hole in the ground." This was the mid-video pivot. This was the moment the entire air war turned. The B-17 was the bait, the P-51 was the trap, and the Luftwaffe was about to fly straight into it.
The Germans had scoffed at the slow B-17s because they were easy to kill. But now, to get to the B-17s, they had to fight their way through a hornet's nest of the best fighter plane in the world, flown by pilots who were no longer playing defense. They were on the offense. And that brings us to 1944. The scoffing was about to be permanently silenced. The plan was set for early 1944. It was codenamed Operation Argument. The press would later call it Big Week. The goal was simple and utterly brutal. Lure the entire German fighter force into the sky at any cost and destroy it. The bombers would no longer be grounded. They would fly, day after day, deep into Germany, hitting the most critical targets, the aircraft factories themselves. They were going to poke the hornet's nest until every last hornet came out to fight. And this time, they would not be alone. Imagine the scene. February 20th, 1944. Over 1,000 heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, lift off from the muddy fields of England, an armada unlike anything the world had ever seen. And surrounding them, escorting them, sweeping ahead of them are nearly 900 American fighters, P-51s, P-47s now with better range themselves, and P-38s. The Germans saw them coming. The radar screens lit up, and they did exactly what Doolittle wanted them to do. They rose to defend their homes. The entire Luftwaffe, every plane that could fly, scrambled into the air. But this was not Black Thursday. This was not 1943. When the German 109s and 190s swooped in for their head-on attacks, they were suddenly, violently T-boned by Mustangs diving from above. The American fighter pilots, fresh, aggressive, and flying a superior machine, tore into them.
The dogfights were a chaotic, swirling melee from 30,000 feet all the way down to the treetops. For the bomber crews, it was a miracle. They still had to fly through the flak, which was as thick and deadly as ever, but the relentless, hours-long torment from fighters, it was gone. They would see the dogfights, a frantic ballet of tracers and smoke trails happening miles away as their little friends did their work. For 6 straight days, the 8th Air Force, joined by the 15th from Italy, hammered the German aircraft industry. And for 6 straight days, the Luftwaffe came up to fight. And for 6 straight days, they were systematically annihilated. The German pilots, many of them now young, inexperienced replacements for the aces who had been killed or sent to the Eastern Front, were simply overwhelmed. They were flying planes that were now, suddenly, outperformed. The P-51 was faster, could turn tighter at high altitude, and was heavily armed. The numbers tell the story. During Big Week, the Americans lost 226 heavy bombers and 28 fighters. A high price, but the Luftwaffe lost, by conservative estimates, over 600 fighters. And more importantly, they lost over 350 pilots. These were pilots they could not replace. These were the last of their experienced veterans. In 1 week, Jimmy Doolittle's gamble had broken the back of the German Air Force. The scoffing was over. So, what happened when the Nazis scoffed at the American bombers for not being mosquitoes? They forced American industry and ingenuity to create a new solution, a hybrid solution. The Mosquito was a brilliant plane, and it did play a vital role. Mosquitoes were used as pathfinders, flying ahead of the main bomber stream at night to drop flares on the target. They were used for high-speed nuisance raids, forcing the Germans to keep air defenses active. It was a vital precision tool. But it was not a war winner. It was a scalpel. It could sting, but it couldn't destroy the hive. Its small bomb load, even the massive blockbuster bombs it sometimes carried, just couldn't deliver the tonnage.
The American B-17s and B-24s, the slow, flying targets the Germans had laughed at, they were the war winners. They were the hammer. And once the P-51 Mustang had cleared the way, they became the unstoppable, war-winning hammer they were always designed to be. From Big Week onward, the Luftwaffe was a spent force. The American bombers could fly over Germany almost at will. The losses dropped from a staggering 10 or 20% per mission to less than 1%. And now the full, awesome, terrible power of the arsenal of democracy was unleashed. The B-17s and B-24s returned to Schweinfurt and leveled it. They went to Berlin in broad daylight. They systematically destroyed the synthetic oil plants that kept the panzers running. They smashed the rail yards. They pulverized the factories. When D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, the Allies had total air supremacy over the beaches of Normandy. The Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen. Why? Because it was already dead. It had been bled white in the skies over Germany. Killed by the P-51s it had risen to fight, lured to its death by the very bombers it had scoffed at. The Mosquito was a plane of genius, a brilliant, clever design. But the B-17 was a plane of will, a stubborn, rugged, powerful machine that represented a country willing to take a punch, get back up, and throw a harder one. The Germans laughed because the B-17 wasn't a Mosquito. They stopped laughing when they realized that was the whole point. It was never meant to be. It was meant to be a fortress. And in the end, with its little friends by its side, that's exactly what it was. This was just one story, a conflict of ideas, a war of philosophies, fought 25,000 feet in the air by the finest generation of men our country has ever produced. Their courage in the face of those odds is something we must never,
ever forget. Subscribe to this channel is the simplest and best way to make sure you never miss a single one of these histories. We're grateful to have you here to help us remember.